Who's excited for lunch? All right. Yeah, I'm in your way, so let's do this. I want to talk to you today about how we, as software engineers and developers and designers, can spread larger messages to larger communities and make software that makes a statement. But let's get this out of the way first. Yes, I have seen Breaking Bad, and I am aware that I kind of look like a less cool Jesse Pinkman. Like Jesse Pinkman went soft, got clean, and is now the assistant manager at a Jamba Juice. My day job is at Formidable. We make React apps, React Native, GraphQL, and Node applications. We have offices in Seattle and in London. I work in a small team here in Denver. So if you want to talk about that, just come find me later. We're going to do this first. And if you want, you can come to our React Intermediate workshop tomorrow, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to up your React game. But outside of work, I'm pretty interested at this intersection between software and art and culture. I've done a few little projects in this space, from like little gimmicky games to interactive art. And I'm going to talk about one of those projects today, kind of the process of creating that, what the response was like, why I did it. But honestly, what I'd really like to talk about is how you can use the privilege and talents you have that you might not know you have to make software that makes a statement. So we'll start off with a quick demo. Here's my site. I pull it up in a tab just in case. All right, so this is the offline-only page. Pretty simple. We just have a little message that tells us that we must go offline to continue. So disconnect my Wi-Fi. Oops, missed it. All right. And then the page magically transforms, and we have a short little essay here. Now, I'm not going to read you my own words out loud, because that'd kind of be like slam poetry, and that's not what you signed up for. But I will touch on some of the major themes here. So the big theme of the essay is that a constantly connected world basically means a constantly distracted life. And we all know this intuitively, and those distractions come from outside, from notifications, and they also come internally in your own distractions, those little Wikipedia hunts you go on trying to find just the next little answer. And so I developed a little life hack, and that's when I really need to concentrate, when I really need to get something done, I just cut off my internet connection. In fact, I wrote most of these slides while my Wi-Fi was off, because that's the only way I can concentrate sometimes. And I'm also really interested in this idea that certain types of content could require us to disconnect, right? Like the offline-only project does. It requires you to disconnect. And there's a little bit of an interplay there, right? It's a message about disconnection, and it's also requiring disconnection. And this gets after something that media scholars have said for decades, and that's that the medium is the message. And this sounded like garbage to me at first. This just sounds like gibberish. But I think it's actually something very, very intuitive. So just like a message about disconnection could require disconnection, we understand this intuitively. If someone sends you a very heavy message, but they choose to do it via text versus just talking to you in person, like, hey, I think we need to go on a break, that says something about the message, and it says something about the messenger. We understand that the way a message is delivered is very, very important. So I think it's interesting to ask, like, why would I do something like this? Quite honestly, a lot of this is just curiosity. I wanted to do something new. I was very fascinated with this idea that you could create a piece of the internet that required you to leave the rest of the internet to see it. I hadn't seen that done before. And once I realized that that was technically feasible, I thought it would be fun to try to convey a message in that vein. And this was moderately successful. I think this resonated with a number of people. And so we can ask ourselves, what makes a message influential? How could we, when we want to spread other messages, think about what makes them stick? And I think for this project specifically, there are a couple of characteristics. I think first off, the novelty of it, participation and relevance, and we'll go into those very briefly. But first off, the novelty of a message can really make it stick. The fact that people don't usually have to do this, that websites usually don't require them to go offline, means they might remember it. It might influence them a little bit more deeply. But even more interesting than that, I think, is participation. Requiring someone to do something, to come into the experience with you, is very important. I think about this like with concerts. So if I go to a concert and I sit in the back and just kind of nod along, but don't really involve myself, I'm much less likely to remember it or enjoy it than if I'm up at the front and singing along with everyone else, if I participate in the event. And participation shouldn't be confused with just interaction. These are two different things. Participation could be thought of as a deep interaction, an actual involvement that might even require something of me personally or emotionally. And I've gotten the skeptics, don't worry. I've gotten people say, like, isn't this just a gimmick? Like, this is a fun little gimmick. And I'm sure that you could view it as that. I'll take that criticism, that's fine. But I hope it's a gimmick that could cause people to rethink a little bit about their life or how they use devices. And finally, any message, of course, should be relevant to the audience. And it's a good thing to ask ourselves whether the message we're spreading is just relevant to us or whether it has wider relevance. And I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with JavaScript? Why would you talk about this at a JavaScript conference? And I really want to reiterate that I think we have a great privilege that we forget about. Because people are living and breathing digital culture, and we're engineers. We create software. And insofar as digital culture is culture, we can create culture. That's a pretty amazing privilege. Another way to think about this is that digital literacy is rising all around the world. People are using their devices. They're learning more about how they can use those devices to communicate and to connect with content. But for almost all people, it's basically read-only. They can experience a new digital creation, but they can't actually make one. And I think that's a very interesting distinction. And that's why I say that you're not a ninja or a rock star, but you might be like Gutenberg. For the uninitiated, Gutenberg was a German. He brought printing to Europe via the printing press in the 15th century. And he was surrounded by people who could read, but only he could mass produce books to be read. And that's a very interesting and powerful distinction. And you might say, wait, but isn't this what social media is? Can't people, lay people who know nothing about software, spread messages very easily? And you're absolutely right. This is a process, it's called the democratization of media, especially media production and distribution. And it's not just social media. You can make essays on Medium, you can put videos on YouTube. If you make music, you could spread it on Bandcamp. And this allows people, again, that have no experience in software to spread a message. But there's a really, really interesting interplay here, and that's that software is enabling this democratization. So if you want people to spread new messages in different ways, you have the power to do that because you can create software. So if we're talking about tech, we should probably talk about the specific details behind this project. The main hook of offline only, of course, is that it does something when your connection changes. And browsers help us out a lot here. So we have a property on Navigator called Online. And we also have some events we can subscribe to, simply called Online and Offline. And those will be fired when the connection status changes for the user, which is pretty useful. But you and I both know it's not going to be that easy. So unfortunately, Chrome on Windows doesn't fire these events like you would expect. And so we need some sort of backup. In this case, we could use a polling backup. So at regular intervals, maybe every second, maybe every 5 seconds, we send a request to a server and see what happens. If we get a response back, even a bad response, that means we have a network connection. If the request times out, that could mean we don't have a network connection. But this all gets a little bit tedious, and I wanted to try to tie this up. So I made a very simple React library that just allows you to have offline and online components that render for you. So we could see what that looks like here. Just very simple components. You get the children of those components when you're offline or when you're online for the different components. If you want something a little more complicated, there's a component with render props, something we'll be talking about tomorrow, should you join me for the workshop, by the way. And what render props would allow us to do is have a little more control over maybe the styling of those components. The other hook here is that the site is not only it's not only available offline, but it can actually be refreshed offline. So we'll switch over here, and I'll refresh the page, and it's still available. And in fact, we can open up a new tab. And we can pull it up on a new tab, which is not something you can do with most websites, right? Like I can go to the most popular website in the world. If I could spell it right, we'll go to Google. And unfortunately, Google is not available to us. I'll avoid the dinosaur pun, you're welcome. There's a very good reason why Google isn't available to us offline. Its service would be worthless. It can't look at the internet. But it's still a fun little hook to have a site that is available offline. And so this is done with service workers. Service workers are background scripts. They're not part of your website, but they can act as a proxy for your website. So they sit in between the browser and the remote host, and they can make a decision. In this case, we go off to this URL. We're going to request this page, and the service worker will intercept that request and say, actually, I have a cached copy for you right here, and deliver that instead. So it's going to be much more performant on a second view, but it also allows you to do it offline. Service workers have very good browser support, but even more importantly for me, because I'm lazy, they're also included in a lot of the starter projects. So I use React, and so Create React App has service workers out of the box. You don't have to configure anything. It's also available in Angular and Vue in their starter projects as well. There are a few other things I like to do for any public project that I think might get a little bit of press or be shared. We should probably talk about very quickly. One is to just serve over HTTPS, because that will help your Google search results. Very easy to do. Another is to use a CDN. There are a lot of free CDNs, content delivery networks, that will allow you to have very fast downloads around the world that won't even hit your servers. And the last one is Open Graph. I'm just curious, how many people have heard of Open Graph? Okay, so a decent amount. I'm surprised at how little we talk about Open Graph, though. I'm actually confused why we don't talk about this a lot. What Open Graph does is it allows you to have previews on social media for your content. So if someone posts a link on Slack or on Twitter, you see a little preview. And what this is it's essentially just little meta properties that we have on the page. So these are the meta properties for offline only. You see we just have the Open Graph title, description, and image. Pretty simple. We just have a link to an image there. And what that means is when someone gives me a rave review like this on Twitter, cute execution, you'll see a little preview here on the bottom. And these are the exact same properties we just saw in those meta tags, right? The title, description, and there's the image that I linked. So speaking of rave reviews, what was the reception like? Honestly, it was pretty humbling. This was shared around a lot. It even made it to the front page of Hacker News, which was a bucket list item for me. And somewhere along the way, someone forked it and made a French version. And so I decided that this would be a really cool opportunity to try to internationalize this. And so using recruits and mainly people that I didn't know, we translated it in. Now it's available in 10 languages. And I only speak one of those fluently. I can show you how this works. So we're using, just have a little drop down here. Show the Spanish translation. It's Persian. And we're also persisting this, it's kind of hard to see, but we're persisting it in the URL so that if you were to, for example, read it in Persian, then you could share it in Persian as well. But of course, we know that the internet is not always a kind place, so we can't forget about the trolls. And I want to show you something I'm very proud about. This is the best troll I've gotten so far. And I'll let you read it for yourself. I'm honestly pretty proud. I want to make a poster out of it. This is so great. It made my day. But you got to expect this, right? If you put something out there, people will respond in different ways. That's fine. And it's not always going to be overt trolling like this. It might be someone explaining to you that you just did it wrong. Here's a minor JavaScript celebrity replying on Twitter, telling me that he would happily retweet me if I just wouldn't have done it wrong. If I just wouldn't have used the library. Should have gone vanilla JS. This isn't, I wouldn't call this trolling. This is more of a compliment. That's real. If you learned a word today, you're welcome. And so whether you have trolls or if it's just a few compliments, you still have to deal with it, right? The age-old advice is probably the best. Just ignore them, right? Just walk away, mute them, block them. It usually is pretty effective. But if you're feeling cocky, if you want to up your game a little bit, you could turn the tables, and you could be nice to them. This will really mess with them. If you're sincere with a troll, if you laugh with them, if you joke around, if you're a little bit vulnerable, how you will really mess up their day. And this is not new advice at all. This is very, very ancient. It makes it into the Hebrew Bible. It's referenced in the Christian New Testament. Here it is in the Hebrew Bible. If your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he is thirsty, give him water. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Look it up. I did not make that up. Isn't that awesome? It's so epically passive-aggressive. And I would also say, don't go it alone. That's my final advice for dealing with negativity on the internet and off the internet. Honestly, I have it pretty easy. I'm a straight white man, and people don't give me too hard of a time. For some of you, it's going to be way harder. And so find a friend. Don't do it alone. So after a project like Offline Only, you might wonder what I decided to do next. And I alluded to this earlier, that I'm interested in this idea of content that requires disconnection, that requires a specific state of mind. And so I wanted to go from just an offline-only essay and try to make this an offline-only magazine. And this would be an instance of what I would call hybrid media. So I'm trying to hybridize two things. I'm trying to take inspiration from print magazines and also from digital magazines. And ideally, what this could look like is that we would have the intentionality and pace of something like a print magazine, where I'm just going to sit down for half an hour, and just read this leisurely and not be distracted by the internet. And I could do things that can't be done in a print magazine, like I can distribute it instantly around the world for free without printing anything. That's pretty amazing, too. And so I convinced an editor to try this out with me, and we called the project The Disconnect. And over the course of a couple months, we worked with some authors and artists and poets and came up with the first issue. So I'll show that to you now. I will, however, go online, though. I almost rolled myself. All right. Cool. So here we see the first issue of The Disconnect. We have a small note here reminding us that we have to go offline. And I'll go ahead and do that again. Don't worry, this is the last time I'm going to change the connection on you. And now the magazine transforms a little bit, and now we have access to the entire magazine. We have 13 different pieces, poems. We have this beautiful cover art, and then each of the pieces themselves will have some art as well on the top. I'm going to show you a couple of those. It's pretty fun. And we're able to do all that, all of the pieces, the cover art, issue art. There's actually a small JPEG cartoon in there. And all of that is under 260 kilobytes, so a quarter of a megabyte. It'd take about a second on a 3G connection to download. And then you have the entire magazine. And Ben's talk is a really good lead into this because we use a couple different techniques to make that happen. And in fact, the whole magazine is a single request. Well, it's two requests, for the HTML and then for a JavaScript bundle. And the way we get away with this is we do a couple things. First of all, we use all system fonts. So what you saw right there, that big header, we're on OS X here, so that's San Francisco. And then for the bodies, we're using Iowan Old Style. We have a lot of beautiful fonts that are available to us now on devices, especially mobile devices, because of the applications that have been pushing that. And so we can take advantage of that. Also, the cover art is just an SVG, so that's going to be a lot more lightweight. And then those the little black and white pieces of art you see on all the pieces are actually just divs with CSS applied to it. So they're very, very lightweight and can be easily transferred. And I like this idea that we have a restricted space to create in. If you have to create an entire digital magazine, but you only have a quarter of a megabyte, that restriction is really fun to me. It's kind of like a haiku, right? You have these specific rules and these restrictions, and that creates a sandbox for creativity. It forces you to be creative. I'm going to give you a quick preview of the second issue. It should be coming out in a week or so. But I think it's another instance of someone else's take on how you can use software to spread a message. So we've been working with an artist named Nick Breeze. He's out of Chicago. And he's very interested in using digital art as digital literacy. Basically, how do you inform the public about the internet and about their devices and how it affects them? And the thing he was interested in was browser fingerprinting. And the quick spiel of browser fingerprinting is that even if you disable cookies and you use an incognito browser and you try to be very anonymous on the web, you still can't do it. You can still be fingerprinted. And this fingerprinting works in a number of different ways. So what Nick decided to do was he made an actual fingerprint here, but then the ridges of the print are the details that your browser is giving up about you that help you be identified. And it's very interesting. Once you combine all these, the combination of all these details makes you almost unique in the world, which is a little bit scary. Things like the fonts you have, the GPU, your time zone, all of those details can be combined to identify you. And so this is just another example of how we're using software to spread some message. I've used that word, I've used messages and statements, kind of these vague words, but they can take many different manifestations. So it could be a simple experiment, like my offline only. It could be a piece of art, like Nick's piece. It could be data visualizations. But most importantly, it could be something not on this list because I haven't thought of it and you have. And that's what I want you to go out and make. That's the really interesting thing. So I ask you, what do you have to say? What's on your heart? What do you know about? What's a message that you want to spread? And especially, is there a wider audience that you want to address? Not just the people in this room, but the culture as a whole. Because I worry that we have this great privilege, but we really like just talking to each other. We are a little bit insular, and I'm a little bit insular. And I think some of this comes from some of the community values here. I don't mean community values of inclusiveness or anything like that. I mean what gets talked about a lot. Let's think about a simple tech stack, right? So on the bottom, we have languages. And on top of languages, we build libraries and frameworks. And on top of that, we build applications. And I would argue that in this community, a lot of attention is given to the bottom of that stack, and less attention on the top. If there are new changes to JavaScript or TypeScript, this is going to create a lot of excitement in the community. Frameworks and libraries, how much time do we spend talking about those? But when it comes to actually applying those things and making applications, we have a little bit less attention for that. And this makes me think of photography. So I'm an amateur photographer, and sometimes when I post a picture I really like, someone will inevitably respond, "What camera did you use?" And this seems to totally miss the point. Like, a good photo has nothing to do with Canon or Nikon. It has nothing to do with pixels. It has nothing to do with focal length. A good picture is about composition and color. It's about storytelling. It's about using light. And so if you get mired in the details of the tools, you're going to miss it. And I'd say sometimes we might be too distracted by the tools. The tools are absolutely necessary. We need them. I'm really excited about them. I use them every day. But don't lose sight of what you want to do with those tools. So I'll leave you with a few things. Please remember that privilege that you have. Right? We're in a digital culture, and you make digital things. You can intentionally design messages. You can intentionally design the things you want to say using something like participation. I'd also encourage you to use technology in some weird and new ways. Use it in annoying ways, right? I totally understand that my project is annoying to make someone disconnect their Wi-Fi. That's annoying. But use tech in weird ways. And finally, don't limit yourself. Don't limit yourself to talking to just this community. Don't limit yourself to talking just about these tools. Because you should know that you're already empowered. There's no need to ask for permission. If you'd like to troll me on the internet, or you want to look at these slides, here are some links for you. Thank you so much.
Does it take privilege to be able to disconnect?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, if I can give a quick plug for that first issue, we had a PhD researcher from New Zealand named Alex who's very interested in this idea of disconnection as a privilege. Because as we become increasingly reliant on the internet and increasingly reliant on connection, pieces of our day, maybe it's keeping in touch with your elderly parents, or maybe it's part of your job, that you kind of get mired in that. And so it becomes a privilege just to be able to disconnect. He notes that some Silicon Valley executives send their kids to school where no technology is allowed. But that's a privilege, right? Those kids are getting education and technology in other ways. So yeah, I would absolutely say it is. And it's not something I realized until I started this project and had some conversations.
And I think even in like this political climate, I know a lot of people who have been, I'm taking a break from Twitter, but it's also like a huge source of news. And so for people who are seeing how close we are to, people who here on visa possibly being put into internment camps, like not being able to enjoy the privilege of a distraction-free environment. So I can see, and I don't think that like the trolls that you encountered were thinking that. I think they were just looking to be shitlords. but I can see some pushback from someone saying, here, disconnect, you're distraction free. I think that implies that all the distractions are coming from technology itself and not what's happening in the world that technology is projecting onto people. So work that into your next version.
Noted.
Yeah. So one thing I like to do with making art using code is seeing how to use these technologies for like the non-artistic things. And so you had created the React component to choose online or offline. What are some situations that are not, mission or message driven that you can use that in?
Yeah, absolutely. So usually we think about disconnection as a bad thing, right? And so maybe you have an email client like Gmail, and it's just going to tell you when you're disconnected, just as a little note, like, hey, you're disconnected, so like I'm not going to be able to send this email for you. So that's a pretty practical one. That's what I've seen it used for.
Yeah, I was really inspired about the idea of using that. I have a pixel art editor, and I recently implemented service workers into it so that it works offline. But there's some components of it some features that would only work online, like posting to Imager. And so I'm like, oh, I can like see if they're offline and like hide that feature. And so that component library seems really would work for that. Yeah. Cool. So tooling, that's like a big thing in JavaScript that's evolving a lot faster now than I was used to when I started. I used to be a Java developer. I always say Java has the best tooling out of any language, and you can fight me if you disagree, because you're wrong. But that's because Java's been around for a long time. I was talking to a bunch of the speakers last night about this, and they all intelligently agreed with me. How can we mentor new developers or like help them understand not to immediately ask what camera are you using? What should they be asking?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I need to say that, like, first of all, I like the tools, and I like taking pictures, and I'm glad there are optical engineers, right? I'm glad all those things exist. So I'm trying to find a balance here, and nuance in the internet is a very hard thing to achieve. But the next question is a good one. Like, when I mentor junior engineers, they are really interested in the tools, right? They're like, oh, should I use Jest for testing or should I use Mocha? And what I try to say is, like, let's think way more about the test we're writing. Like, what do we want to achieve at the end of the day? And it could be, harking back to the early talk, we could think about, like, what do we want to deliver to the user, right? If we can have a user-centric mind, that might help us, like, at least pull us away from kind of these details. Because they can be really fun and really entertaining, but they might not achieve the end we want.
I would just tell them, use the test suite that sounds most like a Starbucks drink. Duh. Anyway, thank you so much.
Cheers, thank you.
Round of applause for Chris.
Thank you.